Hey everyone, Harris O'Malley from DrNerdLove.com. So, when I usually talk about dating issues, I tend to be talking about issues that are facing men from a man's perspective. This week, I want to do things a little bit differently. I'm talking with Jenna Birch, the author of The Love Gap, a radical plan to win at life and love. This is admittedly a book written by women for women's dating issues. However, I think it's actually really worth talking about from a man's perspective as well. A lot of guys honestly have some misconceptions about what the dating experience is like for women. There are a lot of people out there who tend to think that for women, dating is like ordering a pizza. You go online, you pick up your phone, and boom, there it is. That's really not the case. There are a lot of issues that women face in the dating world, and I think it is really useful for guys to be aware of this, for guys to have some understanding, and to recognize how much understanding these issues can affect their dating lives as well. It's a really awesome book. It is a great conversation. I think that you all will get a lot out of it. I was really excited to talk with her, not the least of which being because, honestly, I'm quoted in the book. Just some formatting notes. This was recorded while I was on the road at Emerald City, so I'm recording from a hotel room, so I'm going to apologize in advance for the sound quality. There's also a couple of tech snafus where Messenger just did not want to shut up, so for the first couple of minutes, you're going to hear the Messenger bing come in every once in a while. It goes away after about the 2 to 3 minute mark. Otherwise, I present to you a conversation with Jenna Birch. All right. Hey, everyone, and I am here with Jenna Birch, the author of The Love Gap, which came out just a couple of weeks ago. So, Jenna, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm so glad to be on. I'm an author, first-time author, and I'm a journalist, a longtime journalist, and I have studied dating and relationships sort of in depth for, I think my career spans 7 years now, and so I've probably done at least 5 specifically in this space. The Love Gap was about a 3-year journey, but health and lifestyle and social science is kind of my background in terms of the research that I've been digging into.
So, The Love Gap, which, like I said, has just come out, and it is all about this idea of what women are dealing with when it comes to the dating world. And you were talking a lot about what you called end goal women.
Yeah.
And it's kind of fascinating because it's a lot of people that I hear from my readership kind of have this idea that women have the easy job when it comes to dating, that you can kind of just put yourself out there in the most token way almost and have immediate success with really little effort, while all these guys are having to like pimp and preen and make sure that they measure up in some way.
Yeah.
But reading the book, obviously that is really not true. So like what started you writing the book?
I think that what started me writing the book was realizing how many of, I guess, I used to have a lot of conversations with my guy friends, especially about, why I shouldn't be single and why all my friends shouldn't be single. And also they would ask about them, but they would never like truly go after and pursue and date them, which was a very fascinating thing for me as a woman to be asked this over and over again. And I think the breaking point was when I think I was mansplained my singleness as as a woman about 2.5 years ago by one of my well-meaning guy friends. And finally I decided to sort of break down, and the Love Gap was conceptualized by the idea, does expectation meet reality? For a lot of us, and do we pursue and want the things that we actually say that we pursue and want? And it's a lot more complicated than you think when we have all these psychological layers in why we feel comfortable with certain people and why we want to choose certain partnerships. So I really wanted to dig into what people weren't talking about. I think that was the biggest force behind the book, was all these great single women who kept crying to me that something was wrong. They must have some sort of fatal flaw, but I was like, nope, you all kind of have the same problem if we boil it down to the root, and it's hard out there for everyone. Men, I don't think, the beauty of actually writing the book too was, I got to be nosy with almost everyone. And I loved digging into the difference between men and women in terms of what they were dealing with. And I think a lot of women were dealing with more options than men, especially if you check a Tinder queue or a Bumble queue. And you're going to see my regular standard average guy friends maybe had 1 or 2 matches in their queue, but women had so many false leads and things that weren't going anywhere for the most part. So getting each sexes to see the other side was a big kind of beautiful adventure. But I think everyone that I've talked to has more empathy, I think, overall for what the other gender is dealing with.
Yeah, one of the things I really liked was you got into this seeming disconnect between what men are saying they want and what they're doing when they're presented with someone who apparently, at least on paper, has every single connection that they say that they need. You know, they want someone who's ambitious, someone who's got drive, who's challenging, who's got their life together, and then they meet them and it's, hey, you're great later.
Yeah. That was the really fun part to watch. And I was seeing that happen in real life, but not really having an explanation for it. And I think multiple studies were coming out around 2015-ish, beginning of that year, that were saying like, this is like the modern dream girl. Like she, should have so many different matches. Men want this girl, like 90% of men. And all my friends were kind of like in this weird boat where they were like, well, why don't I have anyone? This is nuts. And then we had this great study from Laura Park, who's a researcher at the University of Buffalo, who kind of showed that psychological distance changes a lot. What we say we want in the abstract is completely different than when we throw somebody in front of us and there's emotions in play and how we feel that we stack up to them. And, if we're comparing psychological, there's so many different facets you compare in like in a moment to moment thing. So I was just like really interested in what we weren't talking about. So overall, though, I mean, I found out that men are just as complex as women, and it's one of the major things that I want to dismiss moving forward. Men have as many questions are as complex, which we don't really give men room to be as complex as women, and they aren't really allowed to say like, I want this. Sorry, I'm having these like pops going off in the background.
That's okay.
I think emotionally men aren't allowed to convey what they want nearly as much and say like, if I'm struggling with something, or maybe I do want this person, but I don't know how to settle into this relationship, but like, how do I get there? They aren't allowed to express that nearly as much as women are.
Yeah. One of the things that I liked is you talked about how much the difference between what men say they want and how much what they actually want varies depending on where they feel they are in their lives versus their partners.
Yeah.
And kind of the way that it kind of triggers, in a way, kind of a form of toxic masculinity, and the idea that the men have to be the dominant one or the breadwinner, or having to feel like, okay, it's great that you have your career, but mine kind of needs to be a little bit better.
Yeah, that was the interesting part too, and you kind of break down what that means in its entirety. The idea that their career matters so much, and then when it's, well, what if you have two careers? It's, well, somebody's might edge out the others a little bit, or we might have to make adjustments. And a lot of men were like, I don't know if I can do that. I want this really smart, driven woman, which I used to. One of my favorite interviewees, he was just very insightful about, how contradictory he was, I think, on the whole. He kind of went with that same thing. I always say, like, I want somebody who's smart, driven, Sheryl Sandberg-like, and then comes down to it, I'm not choosing that person. And I think that's kind of, it is toxic masculinity in a way. I struggle a little bit with that term just because I don't want, there's so much that goes into it. Like the self-awareness is really important, but I think it's so deeply ingrained with how like a lot of us have been raised, it takes a lot to come back from that, but starting to recognize the cycles and sort of how we can free ourselves from those really harmful gender norms it's a start to start calling them out.
Yeah, and you had some really great interviews in there, and okay, admittedly, I skipped ahead a little bit to see where I got quoted, but I liked the person who was talking about his buddy who is in a great relationship with another person who, as you say, is the total package, and his friend is just kind of lamenting it, where he's saying like, my friend is a genius and he's going to do well, but he's not going to do as well as me because he's putting his partner's career first.
Yeah,
which was a really interesting insight right there. Just that idea of, okay, he's doing great, but isn't it a shame that he's supporting someone else?
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting was that I guess the constant comparisons that were going on. And I think maybe men were a little more prone to do this. I think men in general are raised to sort of have this competition attitude. Everything about it is competition. And we keep going back and forth, I think, I guess on, I want people to be okay with wanting what they want, but at the same time, when those things are at odds or contradictory, or like maybe somebody else is following a different path, that I think that there's so much judgment being passed around and external forces that kind of guide the way we build relationships. And I think it's very subconscious in a big way. And that guy especially, you could tell that watching his friend was also an outside force playing into his relationship, which was just, it was interesting to watch. And I don't think even at the end, like we went through multiple rounds of interviews and he was not sure where he was going to end up or who he was going to end up with. And all those forces were playing together, but creates it definitely makes us, more hesitant to commit overall, just because we're so unsure.
Yeah. One of the things that you really kind of come down to is these women who have great lives who are now struggling to find a partner. And what were some of the things that they were going through that you feel like kind of guys don't realize happens?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was, I think there are so many more outside forces that are it's more overbearing in the female world where everyone kind of talks up relationships in this really subconscious way. Like, you're so great. Why are you single? Or like, you haven't dated enough. Like who's on your Tinder queue, or like we should like play around. People are constantly wanting women to engage with that. And especially like most of the women that I talked to, they were dating and for relationships, and it was not for lack of effort that they were putting into it. So I think almost in a way, the more that they invest and the more that builds up, there becomes even more pressure when it's not happening. So I'm seeing that a lot. Like the women would always get on the phone with me for an interview, and they would just be, the immediate thing would be venting, like all the people that were telling them like how this should be so easy for them, and they just didn't understand. So that was a really tricky thing as well. And I also think like men are right in a certain way that like women do tend to get more attention for better or for worse, but the quality of that attention is not always great. And a lot of times it makes women have to filter, and you have very little information about, who has good intentions, bad intentions, who's, just passing time on a Friday night because they're bored, or who's, there's so many reasons you can date, and you have to figure out like who's on the same page as you are. And so women found that like vetting process to be very difficult. And that's where ghosting comes in. And, they're constantly, they're wishy-washy, they're in and out. They have all these new terms like zombies and, submarines coming back from the dead, all these different things.
Submarines, that's a new one on me.
That's a new one where they're popping up. They go underground and then they pop up after a while. So I was like, the imagery is great. But women were seeing that all the time, and they were so frustrated by the inability to even commit to like, getting to know someone. So that was often difficult. And I think that is, we do have like a lack of vulnerability. It's harder to be vulnerable, or it's more cool to just be organic and free flowing about things. And you have to be really intentional. And I think that even women that were these type A women in their everyday life, they didn't know if that type A was really translating to building relationships. They thought like I could do pretty much anything, but it seems like I cannot commandeer my life in this way to build the kind of relationship I want. It just doesn't work in the same way. So that frustration was definitely building up, where the harder they tried, like the further away it seemed.
Did you find a lot of like pressure to be the cool girl, as it were, to kind of pretend like everything is okay, that like they wanted something casual and not actually like express themselves?
Yeah.
There's a lot of that in men too, and we just don't really have a term for it. Just the idea that for guys, at least, there's sort of a feeling of if who cares less wins. Yes. And if you admit that you're into someone at the wrong time, and for some reason there is no exact measurement of the right time and it's always the wrong time, then you're giving up, I guess, your power, or you're just going to scare them off because like, hey, I'm going to be emotionally vulnerable with you. I like you. I kind of want to pursue a relationship, but I'm scared. And then they don't say anything. Right.
I think that there is this idea that relationships or budding relationships are super fragile. And like you could practically blow them over and they'll break. It's like a house of cards. They're all going to fall down. And so a lot of people were really reluctant to say what they wanted. And it kind of led to this really ugly miscommunication, this gap in communication frequently, where people would try to read signs instead of ask what people were feeling. There was always some sign that was going to lead to understanding. And it's like, I remember this one guy telling me this, long 3-month saga with this new girl that he'd met, who he just clicked with, and he was so excited. And I think he was in medical school at the time, and he was just blown away. And he's like, I'm really getting better at communication though. I learned a lot. And, he tells me then this 3-month saga with this girl. And I'm like, well, did you ever tell her you wanted a relationship? And he's like, well, no. And it's like, they could have completely cleared up. He's like, but I know she was into me. I'm like, why didn't you just try to solidify something or get any communication there? And it was like this mind blowing thing where he's like, I could have done that. But, we have this idea, I think it's ingrained that vulnerability is really uncool and intentionality is really uncool. We have to play it, like we don't care for as long as possible to like preserve some dignity or something. But the people that I found that built relationships like most effectively were the ones who were able to throw that cool girl or cool guy out the window. And really be tenacious in going after what they wanted. To some things where I retell stories to my friends sometimes and they kind of like, oh my God, that's so intense what this person did, in pursuing someone that they really wanted. But those are the people that end up with these longer lasting relationships and kind of the metal to make it work. And that was kind of fascinating to me because there are more people playing it cool, but there are definitely the ones that have a higher success rate are the ones that are really putting themselves out there.
One of the things I liked is that you classified guys into a number, or at least the near misses and whatnot, as into various terms. So you had the all that butts or the almost boyfriends. Yeah. And it was interesting. You put them along kind of like on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which actually I thought really tied in nicely with a lot of ideas that men have about what they need to have in their lives in order to successfully date.
Yeah. That was pretty fun to like figure out where men fell in the hierarchy, and reading the book, even I could classify like different guys in different areas of my life that had filled and occupied different roles. And I think in some ways that's okay, the near misses, and like realizing that sometimes it's not going to pan out and it's okay to just accept that it didn't. But also just sort of realizing that it's pretty tough to get people at the exact same place as you are in your life. So that idea of falling on the hierarchy, yes, you might kind of occupy a certain role, but there's so much that's in flux and it's going to keep moving throughout the entirety of your life as you change careers and move cities and pursue a higher degree or whatever it is. You're going to constantly be moving around. So also kind of getting people to realize that is it's a nice guiding point for why things didn't work out, but I also kind of want people to realize that it's more fluid and to just be more forgiving with themselves. We don't have to have it all together to have a relationship. That's such an illusion in many ways. So it's nice to be sympathetic with people and really understand where they're at. I really appreciate that in terms of having empathy for just struggling to sort of find your own place and find your place in a relationship. But it was interesting to see different guys kind of tell me exactly where they fell. Like they didn't know they were doing it in interviews, kind of telling me what was going on and, all that, but would be like kind of all together, but like on the fringe of figuring it out, and almost boyfriends kind of building their career lives or figuring out exactly like what they were going to provide in a relationship and having their ducks in a row, I guess. It was fascinating to sort of see men tell me where they were at without, I didn't really expect that, I guess. Those categories themselves were very easily formed, and like, I didn't do much work in figuring it out. Those were parameters that I kind of found as I went, and they were pretty easily defined, which was surprising.
One of the things that was interesting is the number of people who, like, you actually came up with a pretty good reason why so many of the guys seem to be having this issue of, I want to date this person, but I also want to play around.
Yeah.
And the idea of, okay, you're the perfect person for me a couple years down the line when I'm done sleeping around or whatnot. And it was interesting. You actually had some pretty good, like, some formulas. You broke it down into math about like age and what was going on in their lives to the guys who were like, you're great, later.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely a formula. And what I realized for men was building esteem was such an important thing. And both sexes kind of did it differently. All the men kind of ascribed things, all the things that went into their esteem were very like self-built, which was a lot of playing the field was one of the things, but I don't think it was not about any particular woman. It was the idea of getting people attracted to them as like a process. So that was one key component, along with like career and like working on like peak fitness and knowing where you're at in life. All those things were, kind of getting to the best that you could be as an individual before you pursued the relationship you want. And lots of people kind of discussed this idea that there's always someone else. And I think that our generation today has that idea that, even if you're not always dating at all times, like we have enough access to different ways to meet people, there's always going to be someone else. That kind of idea that once I'm the best I can be, of course, the next person will be there for me. And that was kind of a fascinating thing to watch people go through, because over time, people also started to bring up the concept of paradox of choice to me. A lot of daters would bring that up. They'd be, well, I don't know if I'm crippling myself, kind of thing, by entertaining this idea that there's an endless string of options. So that was also interesting. And I think that over time, you kind of have to negotiate what that looks like, what you think is the best match for you, and when passing that up is going to be really detrimental, and you're going to look back and think, oh, maybe that was the person. There's a lot of men that had reached their 20s, early 30s, and they always had one person, at least, that they were like, I think that could have worked had I not been so silly or ridiculous or rigid about what I was looking for at that time.
Did you find that women were having the same, like, I want to play the market, I want to find my my mate value, I guess? Yeah. Or was that mostly a guy thing?
I would say, like, I saw women go through it earlier. I think that women tended to, especially the novelty maybe wore off a bit faster. Women were a little bit more, it was maybe more of a short-term stay, I think, that they went through. Most women had played the field, but I think that they'd been fatigued by it so quickly that they were really coming out the other side. I think I only saw one woman that I felt was like truly, like, she was killing it. She enjoyed dating. She had it down to a science. She had the apps all going. Like, she had different types of connections. She has dated, like, interesting PhD guys to guys who had, like, taken her out on a yacht in Bali and all these different things that she had, like, really mastered the dating game and had just, enjoyed and settled into that. But for most women, especially, I think the fatigue hit faster. And I do think a lot of that has to do with options, or even when you're swiping on dating apps, like they say, women swipe right like 14% of the time, whereas men swipe on average like 50% of the time. So just like statistically, there are more matches, there are more like potential dates. They roll through things faster. They play the field like more quickly. And they got to that place where, like, I've tested the market. I think I know what I'm looking for. And then they were kind of ready to get there faster.
And one of the things that you brought up is kind of the way that men and women tend to approach things. You called it laser versus web, where men tend to go in stages of, we're going to focus on this one thing and we're going to go for that. And once I get there, that's when I hit the stage and that's when I can do my next project. Where women were more like organic. It's like, I'm going to work on all of these things at once.
Yeah. I think, for instance, like, men kind of went through this idea where they would tell me like what they were doing at that moment. And there was always like one predominant thing that was taking over like their headspace. And for some, like the real deal category, I would say a lot of them were like relationships, like that had like taken the focus. But for other guys, it would be different things, like I'm just dating right now, or I'm going through med school, or I'm, trying to figure out what city I want to live in, or like all these different things where one thing was taking up the headspace. Whereas women were definitely more fluid in their approach. They kind of had the idea that they were going to do a little bit of everything, and they would kind of piecemeal together the life that they wanted, like for each stage. They were just definitely more dynamic in their thinking. And I think that that's kind of, it's something that I noticed. And I think that Helen Fisher's like web versus linear thinking was something that had been on my radar for a long time. And I knew I'd wanted to incorporate it in something I was going to write eventually. And it happened to work really well with the hierarchy and the way that sexes were describing their journeys to me. But that's also something that I've heard a lot of marital therapists talked about like for years. To me, is just like, men focus on one thing at a time, they do it, and then they like move on to the next. Whereas women tend to be a little bit more, like, let's sit back and figure out how to make this holistic plan.
So do you think that's part of the reason why it's sometimes really difficult to find men and women at the same stage in life when they're both trying to date? Because like guys are treating it like almost like that scene in Fight Club. Okay, dad, I got out of college. Now what do I do? Well, get a job. Okay, I got a job. What do I do? Now get married.
Yeah. And it can be a little bit difficult, I think, especially because it tends to manifest in some interesting things. I think that women tend to be on the whole more, when they're dating, they're more open to things going somewhere. whereas like men are focused on one thing. So even if you think about from the male side, a lot of times it can come off as like real intense. Like if all of a sudden you're focused on dating and like all of a sudden every day is like a job interview to see if like this is going to work. And then, you know, women would kind of get this idea between men who are like totally waffling in the dating field. And then that was okay and it was fun for a while, but also, you know, wasn't going anywhere very fast. And then they would get men that would want to like wife up right immediately. And that dichotomy, I think, was really interesting, where they're like, where is my middle ground? Because that's what women were occupying often, was that middle ground of, we'll see if it evolves and I want to like move towards something, but I also don't want to like leap into a relationship. So seeing that was also pretty interesting. Just the laser focus versus this more web-like, seeing how things evolve. And that crossover is interesting, yes.
As you were interviewing both men and women, and you were doing this over like multiple months, or I think in a couple of cases, years, did you find any real like commonalities where guys, where you could see the like almost the moment where guys had like sabotaged their progress?
I don't know. I think that the one thing that I found that was interesting with men is usually they had like one ex that had really kind of thrown them for a loop. That first like vulnerability moment in their lives, where I think for a lot of men it was relationships. You know, we as women are kind of taught to engage with our emotions from a very young age, and you know, we play with our friends and it's all emotionally based games and things like that. I think that that's very true, whereas a lot of men, their like first emotional engagement like tended to be in a first relationship. And I think that men had a longer and harder road recovering from that first like vulnerability, where relationships that would happen in their wake like would not be good because they hadn't dealt with that baggage from the first relationship. And I felt like that was a very interesting component, where I was seeing like men almost sabotage themselves because they were kind of repeating these same narratives, or they would get like a little gun shy when they would feel them happening over and over again. So that ability to sort of deal with and move on from the past and sort of learn and contextualize, I think that there are studies about how women tend to ruminate on breakups until we have a lesson, like a bunch of lessons that we can like make meaning out of it. Whereas men just kind of move on, so to speak. They kind of brush it under the rug and, you know, hope it goes away. But it does crop up in like kind of triggers in like new relationships. And when you would talk to men about it, like when you'd really dig deep into why do you think that didn't work, you could usually get to the root of there being something with an ex, like something that, you know, she left and it was really sudden, or she pursued her career and like that, you know, seeing other women pursue their careers was just this idea that it wasn't going to work likely. And it was almost self-protective in a lot of interesting ways. So I found that with a lot of men, the commonalities between exes and in not really dealing with the baggage. And, you know, I think it's important to keep those discussions open in your relationships and when you're struggling, and sort of really take the time to digest what's happened, like in relationships, the hurts and the traumas. I think they call them little T traumas in therapy.
That's one of the things I've noticed, is how rarely guys really try to process things. It's more along the lines of like, oh, that sucked, that was awful, I'm so sorry. Or yeah, she was a horrible person, don't worry about it, there'll be better out there. And none of the whole like, okay, yeah, no, are you feeling okay? Are you, you know, do you, no real after, like, I guess aftercare is the best word for it.
Yeah.
Where just trying to kind of process not just like what happened, but how do you feel about it? And can you, you know, are you going to be looking out for this all over again? Sort of, they touched the stove, but they haven't quite learned that not every stove is turned on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a really interesting component. And I think that was also helpful for me to talk to women about, is just kind of, you know, realizing, okay, there might be baggage there. It might exist. It might cause like some internal struggle and maybe like a little bit of freak out when the vulnerability phase happens. But sometimes I think men are just like looking for someone to not walk away. So if I could like, you know, tell women, arm them with this fact of like, you might have to have some emotional, uncomfortable discussions, but if you get to the root of it and you actually like if you give men an outlet for their feelings, having that can be super beneficial in bonding. But I think that that's more on an individual level. Like when you're trying to go between relationships, people are always like, well, how does it work? Like, how do you build these relationships? And that's where you really have to kind of sit down with a single human being and figure out what is your baggage and are we going to get on the same page and can I help you? That you can have those corrective experiences with a new person and not repeat the past, but you kind of have to know what the trauma is from the past before you can move forward. So it's kind of like leveling the building, going down, to the base and rebuilding from the bottom up.
So if a lot of the guys, especially the ones who like, I guess, self-qualified as, the not quite there yet, the almost, the near misses, how many of them had like really solid social bases? Because another thing you talk about is the cooperative play that like women are socialized to do from childhood. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've found many times over the years is how few emotionally intimate friendships men have, especially with other men. And I think that sometimes I'm convinced that is one of the reasons why guys have a lot of problems with dating and have issues being ready.
Yeah, and that's something that I found, and it was a piece that I wanted to put in the book, but it just never quite fit. One of the best discussions I had with a guy, for instance, he was about 25, and kind of, he would probably be an almost boyfriend or a Mr. All That. Like, he was very emotionally engaged. He had done a lot of work on his own, like to be as good of a dater and potential relationship prospect as possible. But he kind of told me, he said, I don't think women are aware. He said, usually the only two people in my text conversations, like in any given week, is like the girl I'm seeing and my mom. It's like, I don't have any other text conversations going on. Like, I don't have these deep friendships with my guy friends. When we go out, it's like drinking and like basic talk. We don't have like those like really dynamic, interesting conversations like I see my girlfriends have. He's like, sometimes, my friends who are girls, they're, they are the ones I talk to, but I get to do that so seldom. And I think that is totally stunting in relationships, just because, especially when it comes to breakups or processing things on an emotional level, when women have a breakup or they have something really traumatic happen, we always go to our girlfriends and who are there with, a bottle of wine and all the ice cream we can eat while we discuss our emotions. And I don't think men have that same chance. And it's really a shame. And I do think it takes like a longer time to get to that level of maturity to have a relationship, just because the emotions aren't as nurtured.
Yeah. We've basically got beer, pizza, and that sucks. That's rough, buddy.
Yeah.
Please don't ask me anything about it.
Yeah, I can honestly say that no guys have ever I've never been privy to a conversation like between guys where I've really seen them like open up about emotions and get deep in that way, which seems like a very core component to all my female friendships. So that's definitely an interesting component, and it's something that I think we're kind of starting to get in there with really basic levels about how we raise boys and how we raise girls, and how that's very different, even from the time that they're young, how it's so achievement based with men and like what are you winning today. whereas girls, it's like, let's develop like a fully fledged emotional base for you to have a well-rounded life that's setting us up for success with relationships, whereas with men, it's really not. It's sending it down kind of a polar opposite road to kind of work your way back. So I think that the conversations are starting to happen, but we're still kind of dealing with this generation that didn't quite get that. In past generations too, the stoic male trope still exists.
Yeah, the lone survivor, the lone wolf who doesn't need anybody. He's just completely self-actualized.
Right.
And it makes for great stories, but in reality, it just means that you're lonely and have no one to unload with. And so, like, one of the things I see happen so often is, like, in relationships, has been, okay, I've got a girlfriend, and she's now my therapist.
Yeah, and that was really interesting too. I actually talked to a researcher about that, and he was kind of split. He's like, that dynamic can work, but he said that's putting a lot of pressure on one person to be everything. And I think that, but I am seeing that more commonly. I think is like women become the therapist in the relationship, and then they don't really know how to get out of that role. And I think that that's a little bit trickier. And I mean, I want to find that like delicate balance between let's have empathy for each other and really help through those problems, but not put so much pressure on our partner that it's just going to break eventually.
And one thing you did when you were talking about like the guys who got away, all of the various taxonomies aside from Mr. Ready, was how to handle these relationships. How did you come up with like the strategies for if a woman was interested in this guy and he wasn't quite there yet, to how to keep him around or at least keep the relationship going until he was?
Yeah, so I kind of like to think of dating today, I think, is more of like definitely more of a web of interactions that you're having with people. And it doesn't have to be explicitly romantic right away, or it doesn't have to like move quickly, but it has to have like a mutually beneficial purpose. So the big thing that I did was I took all of these interviews compiled from men and women, the different types of relationships they had, and then the ones that worked out. And I tried to synthesize all that information, like how did they make it work? There were always, women in the Mr. All That But camp who ended up married to them, or like, they had an almost boyfriend that became their long-term boyfriend. And I figured out like what the steps were to sort of get from point A to point B. Because there was a lot in those camps that, obviously it didn't work out didn't work out a lot more than it did, based on what people were telling me of their past experiences. Those relationships were inherently more fragile. But if they wanted to be nurtured slowly, I think that even slow history built is still history. And you're still creating that with someone, those positive experiences, even if they're like low intensity touches. So from the bottom of like all that, I think all that is the most intense. And I would think of almost boyfriend as like the least intense, kind of friendly with a little bit of flirtation rolled in. Kind of what was a comfortable dynamic for each. And I think that the women that did it right were the ones that were kind of my models, and the men more on the real deal side, who kind of knew how to build relationships. But the women and the way they interacted was basically my model, the ones that ended up in successful long-term relationships.
And there was one thing you said. You're the first person I've seen who referred to backburnering as anything other than just straight negative. And I really like the way that you put it. You said they know that sometimes that the best meals are the ones that take the longest to cook.
Yes. And I think that was the one weird thing about this entire experience was realizing how few people had the story of, we just met and everything was great from day one. Most of the people that I ended up talking to had a little bit of a wonkier path. There were many women who told me like, I had to pursue my husband. I had to like, send him 3 invites to the different dates, and he finally showed up to one, and all these different things where, it seemed like they were putting them off, but a lot of it was, insecurity or being unsure, like all these different, everybody gets in their own head. So you can sit there and hypothesize about, why you feel like you're being on the back burner, or you can be like, maybe he did have a busy week. Like, as long as it's not affecting me too much psychologically, why not? You can feel it out and see what happens. I think that if the cornerstone is eventually like respect, like you feel like that person respects your time, and you're having a mutually beneficial like interaction, there's really no harm in seeing, where different connections go, even if it's not going anywhere quickly.
Did you find that a lot of the guys were having issues even reading the signals or second guessing themselves, or did they just, were there more cases of this person? Because you talk about a lot of women who are just always all but throwing themselves at a guy and wondering why is he missing this? Were they straight missing the signals, or did you find that they just weren't, they felt like they couldn't respond?
I think that it was that uncertainty element of like, it was not only uncertainty, it wasn't really how they felt. It was like, do I want to initiate this like big relationship? And I think a lot of women too that have their lives all together and they're very type A and they're very, think that there are certain expectations that men perceive go along with that. And so I think a lot of them were not missing the signals. They were wanting to slow it down. And they were like, I'm going to hold off until like, I know what's going on. So until I'm sure that this is what I want and I can handle this. And men would tell me that on the flip side of being like, I just wasn't sure if I could do it yet. And I mean, one interviewee, I remember he ended up, there's actually a pair of interviewees. I didn't get to include both, but they both ended up like meeting the girls that they are now with in college. And they didn't pursue them then for various reasons, but they ended up calling them like 5 years down the line after graduation and being like, this was the person I always wanted to pursue. But one specifically sent me, he said, I said, well, why didn't you do it like back then? Like if you were just excited back then, he's like, I asked myself that question all the time. And he said, it just boils down to like not having the confidence and not feeling ready. But despite knowing that there was a connection there. So just because there is, I wanted to dismiss this idea that, just because like somebody's not pursuing you means that they're totally uninterested. People have their own baggage and their own things that they're dealing with in their life. And sometimes they just genuinely don't know if they can handle the kind of relationship they feel that they might have with someone. So that's what I was seeing more so than missing the signs. It was just that uncertainty of like, if this explodes, can I handle it?
Yeah. And I liked the fact that you emphasize that a lot of times when the things don't work out, when you get ghosted, when the guy seems to be missing the signals or deliberately ignoring the signals, a lot of times it's got nothing to do with you. And I think that's a message that doesn't get shared enough.
Yeah. I mean, that was the big thing that I had seen internalized among a lot of women that were, in that 25 to 35 age range too, and kind of like getting older, getting up there and having dated a lot. They had internalized the Sex in the City, he's just not that into you kind of message, which gave them a massive complex in a lot of ways where they're like, so many people are not into me. This is nuts. But I wanted people to think first, maybe it's not about you, and kind of, instead of leaping immediately to like, let's take responsibility and try to change myself to be someone completely different who might be a more viable partner. Like, no, you're going to change yourself in a way that you're going to actually shoot yourself in the foot in a long-term sense, because you'll be less yourself and less available to be attracting the right kind of person who's going to appreciate you for that.
And with you've had so many conversations going back and forth with men, with women, getting their perspectives, and and one of the things that kind of comes up in your book is how many times that you're both saying, like, men and women are both saying the same things and missing each other entirely. Like, what would you say what would you want to recommend to people to make sure that we are not having these cross wires or these miscommunications, so that everybody can get closer at least to being on the same page?
Yeah, I think that the big thing is everybody thinks that they're being more clear about the communication that they're having than they are. And a lot of it is like, I'm saying kind of what I feel comfortable saying, and then I'm half reading the signs. And I think that that was the big thing that I was seeing in these cross communications, where if we were just clear and we had one of those defining the relationships, I think you wrote about this not too long ago, defining the relationships conversations. I can't tell you how many people are afraid to have one. And I just did a poll because I'm working on my own separate, like, almost journalistic thing. I just did a poll on my Instagram, and more than half the people said they were terrified to have a defining the relationship conversation for whatever reason. In that, having that evolving conversation and clarity about, okay, what am I today? Like, what do these terms mean? What do I want? And let's just make sure that our communication and our language that we're using for having these conversations, like, people don't even mean the same thing when they say relationship anymore. You have to define what that means.
Yeah.
So be very, very clear and specific about what you're looking for and what you think is going on. And it can be an evolving conversation. It's so important that you're even more clear than you think. And you're not taking verbal cues or, like, little ticks and trying to read into them, because that's what I see is people rely way too heavily on the nonverbal communication, when a lot of people are just as nervous to have these conversations on the other side. So my big encouragement is to be as awkward and excited about relationships as possible, and just, like, let that enthusiasm shine, I guess, in a way, and be very clear until you know where you're headed. You're not going to have anything really beneficial. And I think that more people walk out of those conversations just as unclear as when they walked in. So make sure that if you want something and you want a relationship to evolve in a certain direction, you're having a really open communication about that, and it's an ongoing thing until you feel like you're comfortable knowing what's going on. Because it'll devolve pretty quickly and get a little messy. I've seen a lot of things go south over those specific conversations, or lack thereof.
You wrote this, primarily for women, as a guide to here's how you navigate dating these days. But I think a lot of guys should read this, because I think getting some empathy, getting some ideas of what women are going through would be great. There's a lot for guys to pick up from this, but is there any one thing that you really hope that, like, anyone who reads your book, any guys who read your book, like, picks up about dating and what women are going through, and it might make life easier on everybody?
Yeah, I think that what I think I want men to realize is that women they don't have nearly as high the expectations, I think, as they place on themselves. I think that women are more open to, like, working with people, and they really want partnerships today. And they're not putting all this emphasis on making sure you have everything together. That's like a toxic masculinity idea that, you must be the stoic male who has the perfect job and, like, the great paycheck and can be totally supportive at all times. We're all human here, and, like, we're all flawed, and figuring out that, somebody can see you for you and appreciate you for where you're at is a really important thing. And I also think that being able to classify like these different types of not ready and realize where you're at and where you can grow from that, I think is also really important. And making steps to get closer to the relationships you want. Like if you consistently find that you're an almost boyfriend, like making those like baby steps to get closer to the people that are really interesting to you. You know, a lot of times they want to get closer to you too. So just kind of recognizing yourself within those profiles, I think has been really helpful, especially in the guys that have told me you've read the book, like seeing like, oh, I keep being this guy, like I can make like small steps and they might be like reciprocated in a big way and I can eventually end up with the kind of relationship that I want.
Thank you so much for this. Jenna Birch, author of The Love Gap. Where can people find you when they want to want to find you on the internet?
Oh, yes. So you can find me on Twitter and Instagram. That's the easiest way to reach out to me if you have any questions, thoughts. Love to hear them. Or you can find the book now on Amazon or in stores.
Thank you. And I'm going to have a link to buy it in the show notes. And I really do think, I think a lot of guys should check this out because it's really helpful to see how the other side lives, as it were. Thank you so much for coming on here. It's been great talking to you.
Yes, thank you.
Hey, thanks for checking out the latest video. If you've got a short dating question or a topic you'd like to hear about on here, hit me up. Share it in the comments below or send it to me at doc@drnerdlove.com with "for YouTube" in the subject matter. Since we're talking about dating and relationships, this would be a great time to check out one of my books. Might I suggest New Game Plus, The Geek's Guide to Love, Sex, and Dating. This is the instruction manual that guys wish they had gotten when they first started dating. Links to buy it are in the show notes below, and if you do check it out, do me a huge favor, leave a review on Amazon and Goodreads. That's a big help for any author. If you dig the video, then you know what to do. Hit that thumbs up button, let me know, be sure to share it with all your friends. If you are really getting a lot out of this, if you are finding that this is helping, and you really want to support the channel, then consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/drnerdlove. Even $1 is a huge help. Meanwhile, you can find me on Twitter at @drnerdlove. Join the Facebook page at facebook.com/drnerdlove. And as always, hit that logo to subscribe, check out my other videos, and I will be back with you next time with more about love, sex, and dating. Later.